Affordable, safe housing is increasingly unattainable for those most at risk. And homeownership, the so-called American dream, is just that for even more individuals and families seeking a place to call home. Capital Public Radio's View from Here series looks at these issues in a new documentary called Place and Privilege. In partnership with the American Leadership Forum, Sacramento County Supervisor Phil Serna and Capital Public Radio's Joe Barr join us next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Joe, whose story in this series affected you and your reporters the most?
Well, that's a really difficult question because a big part of what The View from Here does is tell very personal stories about the lives of people and their challenges. And so it's very hard to say, but I would say the one that really struck me was a woman named Linda. She's 71 years old, and she had been living in an apartment in Sacramento for 25 years, and she was evicted. And her landlord could do that with notice.
Why was she evicted?
The landlord wanted to renovate the apartment and decided to evict Linda and some other tenants.
The whole issue of housing, which most of us take for granted, Supervisor Serna, it seems to be more tenuous at this moment than ever in our region's history. What's behind that?
I think there are a number of things that are influencing the difficulty in acquiring and keeping housing these days, Scott. And a lot of it has to do with kind of basic economic supply and demand here in the region. I can tell you as a native Sacramentan, someone that grew up here, never did I think that communities like Curtis Park, where I grew up, would have homes selling, pushing $1 million. And to me, that's very unsustainable. When you look at the breadth of our economy, and we have an emerging economy here, we're trying to diversify and get away from just being that government capital town. We have a commensurate responsibility to make sure that we have housing at every level for all of the constituents I represent.
Well, I did some research on incomes, and you speak about this being a government town, and as all of us know, historically, government employment has been a proxy for middle-class living within this region. The average sort of blended government salary between all forms of government is between $58,000 and $62,000. Right. Well, if you take the normal ratios in housing of 2.5 times salary or 3 times salary, that's only a $180,000 house. And according to the local Building Industry Association's recent economic study, the average cost of owning a home, purchasing a home, is like $382,000. There's no way that people can bridge that. And so if that's happening for people who are supposedly middle class, for the people that the series really focused on, what has that circumstance done to people's stability across our region?
Well, it upends people's lives, and when you talk about the situation that we have here, the bottom line is that more people than ever are on the edge in their lives. And what's the most basic thing that you can have? It's your housing, it's your home. That's your stability for everything else that you want to do in your life, pretty much. And more people now are finding that they are not able to stay in the homes that they've been in, or they're not able to find a home when they're searching for a place to live. And so then so many other things stem from that. So not being able to find a home leads to a lot of other stressors. Then that you can get into discussions about how it affects people and their health, it affects their family lives, it affects everything that they are as human beings to a certain extent. And so that's really the big picture part of it. So, when you asked me who really struck me, what character struck me, they all did, because in many ways it's relatable, because any one of us could, with a series of wrong events in our lives, we could find ourselves in some of those situations. And that's what's scary about it.
Well, one of the most compelling things in listening to the series was one of your reporters, I believe it was Amy Westervelt.
Yes.
Really, she essentially, in the midst of having a conversation with her colleagues, was pretty emotional about the impact of the reporting had on her.
Yeah.
And she and her other colleague essentially said, but for the grace of God, I understand this, but because for the grace of God, this could be me.
Yeah.
And I think that universality is one of the things that makes this such a big issue on the minds of so many.
I just wanted to add to what Joe mentioned earlier, and I couldn't agree more, that when you look at what housing is, whether it's multifamily apartment living or owning a single-family detached home, of course it is primarily shelter. But historically, in our society, it's been one of the principal means to acquire wealth too, in developing equity in an ownership unit eventually along the continuum of housing. And to think that we are so lopsided in this region in terms of the price point for ownership and rental housing, that people are not permitted to even enter the market and acquire the wealth, that's also something to consider in terms of the ability to grow economically within the region.
One of the things, you have a background in these types of issues professionally. When you look at the economics behind housing, and you're looking at it as a continuum from homelessness all the way up to luxury housing, where is the market broken?
So I think it's fundamentally broken or disturbed now, pick your verb, based on the fact that we are out of balance in terms of demand and supply. If you look at the number of permits that the region, our six-county region, would issue through our various local governments in the past, it was measured in the tens of thousands of units, both apartment units, single-family units. We haven't approached anywhere near those numbers in years in the six-county region, and we're, again, very lopsided in terms of how many folks require homes, entry apartments, versus the ability to pay the price point that is a reflection of that imbalance between supply and demand. We in local government certainly have a responsibility to look at pivoting in terms of our policies, pivoting in terms of how we entitle land to be used for housing, of course being responsible and looking at infill opportunities as well as greenfield opportunities. But that's where I think local government really does play a vital role in affecting the markets.
Well, Cosmo Garvin, one of your reporters, talked about the intersection of race and class on land use policy. Mm-hmm. And those are two factors among many with that, but by implication, a lot of this comes down to the decisions that, to be frank, folks like you and your colleagues make. And just to give you one piece for you to react to, we are trying to do a lot of smart growth within this region. Infill housing. Mm-hmm. Infill housing tends to be more expensive and require more support mm-hmm. from bodies like yours in order to get that moving.
And neighborhoods.
And that addresses things like air quality and transportation right. and all these other things that are all good things that we're trying to deal with. At the same time, the affordability of Sacramento historically was in some ways supported by the sort of greenfield development mm-hmm. that our current policies are trying to kind of remove. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I don't think there's room. I think there's room for improvement in both infill, the prototype infill housing development and the prototype greenfield development. I think the two are mutually exclusive in terms of the kind of quality of life that people want to enjoy in both a suburban lifestyle and an urban lifestyle. In fact, we're seeing more higher density proposals come in for traditional greenfield development in the last 10 years than I've ever seen. And in fact, you mentioned my past working in the industry. Worked on a project called Greenbrier here in Sacramento about 10 years ago, which really pressed the envelope then in terms of getting those densities about as high but remaining marketable as possible in a greenfield environment with a light rail station as its centerpiece. And so I think there's all kinds of room, Scott, to really be responsible in terms of how we look at the edges of our community and how they develop, as well as the infill opportunities in the middle of our communities.
But traditional answers, like housing vouchers,
Yeah.
the reporting that is in the documentary would indicate that that just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, increasingly vouchers aren't working, but vouchers have been a challenge for a lot of people for a while. In 2014, the last time vouchers were issued, there were 48,000 people who applied for 12,000 vouchers that were available. So that tells you that the demand was certainly outstripping the supply. So that was already part of the problem. Now, increasingly with the hot real estate market, we're seeing that vouchers just aren't being accepted by landlords and property owners.
Which is weird because you would think, vouchers mean that you're not going to deal with, the rent not getting paid. And what's better for a landlord than someone who is always going to pay on time?
Yeah.
That was astounding.
Well, and what we hear from some landlords is that the vouchers just entail too much bureaucracy, and it's just easier. There's so many potential tenants lining up who aren't offering vouchers that it's just easier to go with those people as opposed to dealing with the bureaucracy that they say goes along with the vouchers.
And when you look at these different vignettes, there was a woman who complained about the conditions and wanted repairs, and I don't know if that's the person you were referring to.
That's a different person.
Okay.
But so there's a common theme here, actually.
Yeah. But what it appears is that not only are people at risk, but they don't really have redress if they're being untreated or treated unfairly by the system.
Yeah, and that's where if you talk to people who are in these situations, they feel as though the system is rigged against them. They're told that they have rights and that they can complain and get redress, but really for many of them, the sense is that if they complain, they'll get kicked out. And the landlord can use any excuse that he or she wants, but that's the reality of it. And so they feel that it's better to just not say anything, and they'll live with properties that have been deteriorating for a long time because they don't want to risk being kicked out, and they don't feel they have the agency to complain and have it be resolved.
What's the easier problem to solve? Affordable housing or homelessness, or is that a false distinction?
Yeah, I think addressing both is incumbent upon people like me in elective office to simultaneously address, quite frankly. And I think to Joe's point, what he just mentioned, I think is very important in terms of understanding the voucher system. And this is the intersection of your question here. We, the City Council and the Board of Supervisors, acted this past winter to promote and reprioritize a whole set of vouchers for formerly homeless individuals. It's going to be part and parcel of a new day, quite frankly, working with the city leadership to house folks and to provide wraparound services. But that housing component with vouchers as its centerpiece are very critical in a tight market. When landlords have the kind of options that they do based on a 2% vacancy rate, it's very difficult to maintain their interest in participating in the voucher system. So that's an example in response to your question about where affordable housing has everything to do with the ability to significantly address people's circumstance when they're suffering homelessness.
And there's a specific bit of data about just connecting the voucher program to homelessness. So, I mentioned there are many more people who applied for vouchers than were available. The waiting list to get a voucher is years long. There's this is from the Sacramento Housing Authority, there's a 30% of the people who are on that waiting list will likely end up homeless.
Really?
Yeah, so, and that's from the Sacramento Housing Authority. So that shows you the connection between the vouchers and the homelessness, and how close the two are aligned, and how these are people who are really on the edge.
One of the most fascinating things about the series was there was a segment that focused on homelessness, and one person made kind of a tongue-in-cheek comment, said, talked about that we're still talking about homelessness 11 years after the initiating of the 10-year
plan. We're in year 11, yes.
Yeah, we're in, but also spoke to the fact that many of the conversations about homelessness assume that the conditions that when that 10-year plan initiative was first contemplated are the same, and that even the very nature of homelessness has changed.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think of homelessness as one end of the housing crisis spectrum that exists. So it's not its own unique problem that's separated out on its own, it's part of the continuum. And more people are now falling into that end of the spectrum because of the situation that we've been describing here. So that's why when we're looking at solutions to homelessness, and we're looking for solutions to the housing crisis, the two are interconnected.
How do you react to the notion that because Sacramento, by some estimation, is the hottest real estate market in the country at this very moment, and that the capital markets are now interested in investing in Sacramento, and if all we do is build enough market rate housing, then what will happen is that it'll free up space along the continuum, and some of these problems will just take care of themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty standard definition of trickle-down housing economics, and I don't know that I necessarily subscribe to that. I think there is a place for local government to play a very direct interventionist role in terms of setting policy and appropriating resources so that the market for market rate housing understands that there is responsibility to make sure that whatever housing is going to be developed responds to the entirety of the market, not just one segment of it.
Bill Kennedy, who was an attorney for Legal Services in Northern California at one point.
He's featured in one of our podcasts.
Yes.
Yep.
He made the comment actually in one of your podcasts where he said, when we look at the land that is available for development in the county, and we say 100% of it goes to market rate developers, we are saying that we're only going to build something for the top 30% of the socioeconomic strata, and everyone else can deal with the crumbs that follow that trickle down. To your point, what type of policies are called for today that address making sure that we are building all along the continuum?
Well, there's not just one silver bullet, just like in most challenges in local government. I think it's going to be a suite of policy interventions. One that I can tell you that we take advantage of at the county, and I know other local jurisdictions in the region do as well, is a density bonus program where developers of market rate housing, both affordable multifamily apartments and single-family detached homes, when they come in with these large plan unit developments, they're looking at different alternatives in terms of taking advantage of what a local jurisdiction might offer in terms of a bonus to actually build more units on a given amount of acreage in exchange for making sure that there is an affordability component to the project. And so I think it's those types of trade-offs that we think carefully about in local government as we shape things like our zoning codes, as we update our general plans, as we set other ordinances and laws in effect and in motion to really make it hospitable to develop housing, but do it with some responsibility and some intent in mind to make sure that everyone is going to be housed, not just a certain segment of the population.
When your reporters were going out and essentially creating their particular segments, overall, what did they learn about this region and this problem that was an aha moment for them?
Boy, there was so much that we all learned, and this was really a project that began more than a year ago. And I guess we were quite prescient in determining that this would be the hot topic right now. I think, one of the big things was going back and looking at the history of Sacramento and how we got to where we are now. And of course, Sacramento is one of the most diverse and integrated cities in the country. But one of the things that we've learned is that it's becoming less integrated. And there's a trend that's happening just because of a lot of the factors that we're discussing here.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things when I was going through all of the segments and listening to them, and also looking at some of the visuals that were on your website, one of the things that I noticed was your team looked fairly homogeneous.
Yeah.
Would it have been a benefit to have maybe adding some reporting that was more reflective of the population that you were studying?
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point. It's a challenge that we have. There's a whole other show on journalism, Scott, that we could have, and wanting to be more diverse in terms of who we have in our newsrooms. I think one thing that's very important to point out is that our reporters, while they may be a bit homogenous in terms of their skin color, a reporter's job is to go out in the community, and we spent a year in the community talking to people from all backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and those stories come out in the documentary in the various pieces. And we made specific efforts to make sure that the people that we covered, who were in the documentary, are as reflective as possible in terms of our reporting. We could do better. We can always do better. So that was one of our goals. So
well, one of the things that came up was that one of your reporters, it appeared that it was very interesting, Cosmo Garvin. He seemed a little bit like he was kind of caught, because the reporting that he did related to race and demographics and its impact on land use policy was really powerful and illuminating. But it almost seemed like he didn't feel like he had the agency to really call it as he saw it for some reason, and that's really where the question stems from.
Yeah, and you can interpret that in any way that you want, and I think there are those challenges when you're somebody, a reporter who's coming in to a topic that may affect people of different backgrounds, and you want to address what they're saying in the best possible way. I can't speak for Cosmo, actually, but I do know that he's a really good reporter in terms of trying to convey the situation, to assimilate it, understand it, and then convey it.
What do you hope that the people who listen to the entire documentary, what do you hope that they take away from it?
The takeaway? I think the takeaway is that there are more and more people who are living on the edge in our community, and there are economic forces at work that are taking away, as you said at the top of the show, there's an American dream, and homeownership is part of that. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for more and more people. This isn't just about homelessness or low-income people. This is middle-income people who are now finding that dream harder to attain. And that affects the entire makeup of the community of Sacramento. It affects economic plans that the city has to grow. And so it casts a shadow over the future. And I think we go down into the granular aspects of it, and then you can back out and you can say, this is a threat to the future economy of the region.
And the implications of those factors that Joe just named, what's our region look like 10 years from now if we don't solve them?
Well, I think it's perhaps best answered, what will the surrounding regions look like? Perhaps they're the ones that have something to gain in terms of out-migration, because it's no longer affordable to live in the Sacramento six-county metropolitan area. That's something similar to what we saw happen to the Bay Area back in the dot-com boom of the late 90s. We saw places like Los Banos, which were exploding with new subdivision development for folks to literally live hours a day and then commute to the Silicon Valley for their employment during the daytime hours. That's not the kind of region I want to be part of. And you know, in terms of my service on the Board of Supervisors and working with other colleagues in elective office, we have a responsibility to make sure we don't become that kind of region.
All right. Well, a very fine documentary.
Thank you.
That I got a lot out of it. I hope that the listenership is huge.
Thank you. And we're continuing the reporting. This issue obviously isn't going to end, and Phil's continuing to work on it, as well are many others, so we'll be there.
All right. And that's our show. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.